Stuart Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, it is a pleasure to speak on the Canterbury Property Boundaries and Related Matters Bill. And I say that because many of my colleagues don't think I am a Canterbury MP, but in fact, the Kaikoura electorate is actually a little bigger than the state of Israel, and it does extend from the Marlborough Sounds right down to the Ashley River, which is just north of Christchurch. And many of my constituents were affected by the earthquakes directly, and some have properties in Christchurch which have been affected by this, but I also have quite a few constituents who have moved north out of Canterbury into my electorate, and I run into those people quite often, and in fact have advocated on their behalf in many earthquake-related matters since the earthquake. So I think this bill is really touches on one of the main tenets in our society, and that is the property, and property which we all hold very dear. And one thing we expect with our property is that it's all set in our boundaries, and the boundaries define our property, and generally it's accepted that property's boundaries are fixed and don't move. And in fact, surveyors generally accept the principle that they don't move at all except for gradual, unnoticeable water boundary movement, which I guess stands for erosion. But in fact, as has been pointed out, over 11,000 properties it's estimated had their boundaries moved by at least 20 centimetres, which is significant by anybody's measure. And the difficulty is that the surveyors, as I said, generally and residents expect that they are fixed. So something had to be dealt with in the law. I was quite surprised that only 11 submissions were received on the bill, as has been alluded to before, but I accept that some of those represented bodies that were quite significant in being the councils and other bodies. I think it's quite significant too that some of the recommendations that came out from the Select Committee were quite significant in taking note of the aftershocks and earthquakes that have occurred since, and particularly the one that's been mentioned on Valentine's Day of this year, and extending out this bill to take account of that right through to February of 2022. And that is, if you look back in history, after significant earthquakes in New Zealand, we have had quite a number, that the aftershocks and earthquakes do go on for a long period of time, particularly after an earthquake of the magnitude and the ground accelerations that occurred in Christchurch. So that is quite a prudent matter for the Select Committee to touch on, and I think that would be very welcome addition to the law. The dispute resolution mechanism was submitted. A number of submitters thought that a dispute resolution should be put in the bill itself, but there are, however, existing processes under the Property Law Act of 2007. There are also the Land Transfer Act, and the Select Committee felt that they provided quite adequate mechanisms for dispute resolution, and of course the various parties can always get through a dispute like that on their own. And I think it just was that the Select Committee came to the view that it would add complexity that was unnecessary, and so therefore they decided not to follow those submitters' recommendations. They also recommended amending Clause 10 to specify that it provided the specified criteria be met and no liability for surveyors and boundary determinations done in the interim period between the 4th of September, the first earthquake in 2010, and the commencement of this legislation, which is on assent. And I think that's a very good move. It puts those people, takes any liability away from their decisions that they have made in good faith. But that will be with no negligence, bad faith or misconduct, or non-compliance with statutory obligations and professional standards. So, Mr Speaker, I think this is a really good bill. It's necessary. It's a shame we have to do these things, but given the uncertainty thrown up by the earthquake, or earthquakes, I should say, this is very necessary, and it's with great pleasure that I commend the bill to the House. Thank you.
Speaker.
The Honourable